P&D in context. Here's my house in Gilboa, upstate New York. These old 19th century farmhouses come with a lot of outbuildings. In addition to the one that you just thought of, there are wood sheds, tool sheds, chicken sheds, tractor sheds, and cow barns, horse barns, carriage barns too. And yet, not 500 yards down the road and around the corner, there is self-storage. Last time I checked, there was 100 square feet of self-storage for every man, woman, and child in the country. And if you put those small plots together, you'd have enough acreage to cover Manhattan Island 3 times. As our poet, philosopher George Carlin put it so succinctly, "Amen, it's your shit, but it's my stuff." And after World War II, it was government policy. Everyone should have a house and fill it with stuff. So, how did artists of the 1960s deal with this issue? Well, here's Donald Judd at Dia Foundation, and a lot of very expensive machinery was put in place to make these boxes as close to their Platonic ideal as possible. Words that were used at the time, what's the criterion? Quality and objecthood. I think Judd thought if he could make something so pure, it would plow through the clutter, and you would have in your consciousness this pure object. Or here's the alternative view. This is Jasper John's iconic beer cans that he cast in bronze and then painted to look like themselves. It plays on our ambivalence about objects. The thing is, if you were to take one of these cans and bring it to the Bishop of Chartres in the year 1250, he might very well put it on an altar. It's astoundingly round and miraculously thin. It's the very essence of a vessel and a fair stand-in for the holy chalice. But for us, for me in New York, it's worth 5 cents. So there's no such thing as art for art's sake. Look past style to the deep content of art and find and confirm that content in context. So here I am in 1977. The period I'm talking about is 1972, but I don't have a photograph of me in 1972. I'm soft. I don't have a lot of friends. I came to New York without mentors, without people to, open the way for me. And I was presented in no uncertain terms with what I call the blockbuster avant-garde. If you want to be taken seriously as an artist, these are your options. Minimalism or pop art, that's it. And what was my reaction to this ultimatum as a soft, young man without connections? Are you kidding me? Who made those rules? When, where, who benefits? That's not me. That's not my experience. So what was my experience? When I was about 3 or 4, we moved to Japan. And I was there for several years, from the 1st to the 5th grade. I was back in Kansas City, Missouri, and then back to Okinawa, Japan, from the 5th grade to the 9th grade. My wife, Rena, and I went back in 1972 for a nice, long, many-week visit. And it was the strangest experience for me because I had the feeling that I was coming home. The wandering Jew comes home to Japan. The Japanese kimono is the mother lode of pattern. There are male patterns, female patterns, spring and winter, geometric and floral, bold and delicate, patterns for youth and elderly, for brides and warriors. Ikat, we're going to move westward around the globe now. Moving westward, Ikat on the Silk Road brings a brainiac quality to these patterns. The woof and the warp are dyed before they're woven, and you have to anticipate how it will look once it's tightly woven. In the 9th grade, we went to Tehran. And some of my classmates from Tehran, including Barbara, are listening in. This is a view from South Tehran, looking north up to the Elborz mountain. You remember Alan Hale? Alan and I climbed the Elborz mountains. It must have been 59, the spring of 59. When we went up, it was all shale and screed. There was no snow. But once we crested the ridge, all below us was snow. And we weren't really prepared for that. It was a challenge, but we made it down and all safe. The following year, at the end of the summer, Alan and I traveled by bus from Tehran first to Tabriz, where we spent the night in a big room with all the other travelers, just like we were on a caravan. And then the next day we were at the border. They made it so that we had to spend the night at the border, and then on through to Erzurum, Turkey, where we waited for 3 or 4 days for the train, the very, very slow train to take us to Istanbul. We looked around there for a few days and then flew to Rome. I know it was 1960 because the Summer Olympics were in Rome that year. 2 American 16-year-old boys cut loose in the Middle East. We didn't feel nervous or threatened or that there was any kind of danger. It was just an incredible adventure. This is Isfahan. We went to see Isfahan. It was in Tehran where I became a visually alert person. There were patterns in the rugs on the floor. There were patterns in the tile on the walls. There's all the furniture, the brass trays had patterns, and even our picture frames had this fabulous Islamic marquetry. Patterns everywhere. I just was steeped in it. I don't think we ever got inside that main mosque in Isfahan. I don't think that was allowed, but there were other places where we could see this kind of floor to ceiling decoration. Moving west across the globe, in Venice, there are marvelous tile floors. And if you photograph them at an angle, you have an automatic perspective, and you can use that to make paintings like this one on the right, which is 1974. Continuing on our westward journey, this is a panel from the Alcazar, I shouldn't say, the Alcazar in Seville. I think I can show you with my cursor some things. You see there are these rectangular things with 90-degree angles, and you see them following down. Oh, I want to go back. I got to be careful with that. In between, there are these 6-pointed stars and this funny kind of crank that goes around. It takes a while, but you can actually see the squares or the rectangles in this line. And then you can see them going like this. So there's really more threefold symmetry than fourfold symmetry. One of the important things about patterns like this is that they tell you how atoms can be arranged in rigid lattices to make solid objects. And this is a real head scratcher because I don't know whether there is a material that's both twofold and threefold like this, with the threefold symmetry dominant. We just learned 40 years ago about a material that can have twofold, threefold, and fivefold symmetry. And that's comprehensible because they're projections of the dodecahedra. But this, I don't know where this, I don't know where this came from. The room that it's in is called the Room of the Ambassadors. And there may be 40 or 50 of these panels of each one different pattern. There's a frieze running around the top of these panels in Arabic, and I'll bet it says Allah Akbar. God is great. Allah is great. So this building was built in 1350 with the same craftsmen that built Alhambra in Granada. They were brought to Seville to make this room. Now, the thing you have to understand is that the man who commissioned this building and these tile works was a Christian, what they call the Christian king, one of the Christian kings, Pedro of Castile, also known as Pedro the Cruel. And he wanted something great, and that meant Islam. There's a line of mountain towns right across the top of the peninsula of Cadiz. And for 800 years, the border moved northward and southward, northward and southward. And in that process, astounding culture was created. I think you're going to find this is a leitmotif of my talk. This is the Book of Kells, which I only saw recently, and I was never influenced by this, but I know that some of my colleagues were interested in this kind of very intense pattern of interweaving lines that seem to be central to Northern Europe as well. When I was in college, I'd paint houses for a couple of months, wait on tables for 2 months of the summer, and then travel to the Yucatan to see Mayan ruins. I believe this is the ball court at Chichen Itza, I'm not sure. I took this photograph, and that would be the early 60s. The house I showed you, upstate New York, when we first moved there, first bought the house, you could buy quilts, wonderful, wonderful quilts. The old people were dying and the young people were moving on, and these family heirlooms were suddenly, available. This is a collection of red and white quilts that, forgot the name of the collector, gave to a museum in the city of New York. And this was a show of all of them in the armory. And Norma Roth, who collected my work in depth, lives in Florida, and she commissioned these works from the Seminole Indians so that the technique and the imagery would not be lost. She gave me this quilt. It's the front of it. It was never made into a quilt, just the sheet, and in the hopes that I would treasure it and keep it safe, which I've done. Not only all over the world, but all throughout human history, people have made patterns. Here's one from 25,000 years ago, a crosshatch pattern on a curved surface. And finally, this is a little clay pot. And if you go around the pot, the pattern is continuous. There's no place where it stops and starts. And also, if you see the pot bellies out in the middle, so there's two kinds of compound curvature in that part. But also on the neck, there's a convex curvature. It curves inward. And down at the bottom and the base, there's a kind of a perspective projection where everything gets smaller and smaller, and yet the pattern is continuous. If I were a mathematician, I would say there are three kinds of curvature in this two manifold. And the fact that it's just a little pot and that it was made by a woman who is elderly and who lived her whole life in the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, in no way denigrates this little pot, makes it a smaller thing than it is. It's an important cultural object and a very important source for my art. So in 1979, the great man of art history, Ernst Gombrich, wrote this book, The Sense of Order, where he addresses this issue of why are patterns, decorative patterns, all over the globe, all over human history. And his answer is because of the bicameral mind. The left brain is logical, linguistic, sequential, but the right brain is the Gestalt brain, the brain that sees patterns. And patterns are universal because they stimulate directly the right brain. Now, we've learned more about the brain since then, and the brain is more plastic than that description, and also tasks are divvied up on both sides. But it's still basically true that that patterns speak to us in a way that language and linear logic does not. But that's not the whole story. Here's a pattern of a tire track in the snow in Montreal that I took in the 70s, late 70s. If the snow was good and you had a full tank of gas, you could drive until you ran out of gas, and you'd make 20 million rows of hearts, 20 million hearts in a row, in several rows. So patterns are endless. And that's one of the things that attracts us. Here's a tomb tower in Iran, 10,073. There are a couple of these. I unfortunately didn't know about it and never went to see it, but I believe that a lot of these Islamic patterns originate in this tomb tower and another one close by. There are three bays. I hope you can see the middle bay on the right panel. There's a kind of a special pattern there. I'll show that to you here. On the left, you can imagine, a wooden lattice that you're looking through to see the sky. On the right, the negative shapes, those little pinwheels, are dancing 6 times around a spot. And I don't know whether you can see this, but if you look closely, you can also imagine this is made up of tiles, hexagonal tiles, with only 2 shapes: across, a star shape, and then an up Y or a down Y. It's the same tile, just rotated. So patterns have multiple readings. They're multiple just in themselves. So that was my experience. That was in my brain when I moved to New York about 1970. And this painting was made right after my trip to Japan. You have to think of this painting as a very innocent teenage boy's crush on the great lady of Japanese culture. It's a travelogue of my trip. On the right is the moss garden. There's a celadon color of the water and matching the color of the moss, and the whole landscape just flattens out in front of your eyes. Next to it, moving left, these are images or representations of obi sashes that we spent a lot of time in the kimono shops, just astounded by the richness of the brocade. And more to the left is a Shinto shrine. I've turned it upside down to make it a little more abstract, but that's what it is. Here's another one that I call Persian. Can't think of Persian what, but it's more abstract. It doesn't tell a story quite like the previous one. And it's also very large. I should have mentioned that painting was about 6 by 12. And this is even bigger. And it has the color qualities of Persian miniatures, landscapes that we saw. I see if I can go back a minute. I believe this painting, you can't really write an honest art history of the P&D movement without reference to this painting. It was shown in the Whitney in '73, and it was shown again in my solo show at the Whitney over the winter of '74, '75. This painting, so many people talked to me about it and were engaged with it. I think it gave my colleagues a lot of permission to do what they did next. Now, here's Marcia Tucker. Tucker was the curator of paintings at the Whitney at the time, and she curated that show, along with Elka Solomon, who was curator of drawings. I had a lot of spray drawings in the show too. And in the little brochure that Tucker wrote about my work, she said, the way he uses space reminds me of 4-dimensional geometry. I didn't know what that meant. I don't know that she knew what that meant, but it certainly sounds good. And I went to the math department where I was teaching at Trenton State College. I had a brief and inglorious career as a college professor, mercifully short, brief, because it was only after I got out of graduate school and after I stopped being a professor that my education could begin in earnest. And let's look back at this painting and see what she meant. You can think of this painting as three different spaces juxtaposed. And if you were to put those sections on hinges like it was a real triptych, you could fold the two ends, even though one's longer than it should be, you could fold them in on top of one another. And that's the first thing I did to try to incorporate four-dimensional geometry. I was, as I said, I was teaching at Trenton State College, and I went to the math department. I guess I didn't finish that thought. I met a man, McElroy, who was retiring. And he said, I'm going to give you my library. And I left with an armful of books about four-dimensional geometry, some popular, some very technical. And he challenged me. He said, read these books, it'll change the way you see. Wow, what a challenge. And so I was reading those books, I was trying to figure out what this all meant. And, but the first thing I tried was this folding in so that the spaces were superimposed and not juxtaposed. I had to make the patterns skeletal or linear so you could pile them on. And you could, each of these patterns places the viewer in a different position. You're right looking left, you're left looking right, you're underneath looking up, and even sometimes you're above looking down. You're viewing as though that your location is a plane and not a point. You're viewing as though you could identify the space from a plane. The next thing I did was I wanted to get rid of that solid color background because in applications of four-dimensional geometry to space-time physics, there's no ultimate frame of reference. Everything is contingent and on everything else. So the background are these Necker reversing figures. Actually, they're impossible figures, these blocks, and they don't settle down into one reading. They just constantly flip back and forth. But the picture plane is defined by these little butterfly things. I'm spraying paint through stencils. And so you have a multiple location of where the surface of the canvas is. It's hard to just pinpoint it down. And then on top are these multiple linear patterns. All this was true to the spirit of P&D, and at the same time, it's what I was visualizing reading those mathematics book. And my work entered a crescendo at this time. This is 79. There were several paintings this big at this time, 12 feet, 14 feet. These paintings were shown again, recently in Europe in the P&D revivals that we had. And one of them was in LA, cut short by the pandemic, and going to be shown again at the Hessel Museum at Bard. These paintings were very popular in Europe. There was an American collector who was really interested in my work, but most of them, and I was doing, of those smaller paintings, I was doing 25 a year. I was just dashing through, trying to catch up to the ideas. And bulk of those paintings went to Europe. That dark blue purple one I showed you, that's in the Bischofberger collection. That's a big deal. Then In 1980, I heard about a man, the chair of the mathematics department at Brown, who had put the fourth dimension on a computer. I went up to see Tom Banchoff. I said, show me what you got. He was very generous, sat me down on a workstation that was attached to his $1 million VAX computer. And I could handle these hypercubes and four-dimensional objects that I read about and thought about and tried to imagine. And there they were right in my hand. So this painting, this is about a third of it. The painting is 26 feet long and 8.5 feet high, and it's painted lines and metal rods. And the metal rods look an awful lot like the painted lines. You can't really tell which is which unless you're walking by it. And then magical things happen, the kinds of things that happen on the computer imagery. Whole shapes are hidden behind lines, not just planes, but whole volumes. And things spin out of their location. The way it works is you can't walk around the painted lines, they're fixed. But the metal rods, you have a changing aspect as you walk around. And it's the relationship of the fixed parts to the moving parts that is the key factor. I went back to school, I was about 40, and I went back to school to learn computer programming. I was so lucky with this. My friend Hiroshi and I heard that at Pratt, they were given one of these $1 million VAX machines on the condition that they had to be open to the community. So Hiroshi and I went in to talk to Herb Tesser, the chair of the computer science department. And he said, well, what do you guys want to do with computers? And I said, I want to do four-dimensional geometry. And he said, boy, I've been waiting for you. And he shows me opens the cabinet door to his bookshelf, and he's got all the books that I've got. And so in 15 weeks, I had a rotating hypercube on this $1 million VAX. And I started doing original work, tessellations of four-dimensional hypercubes and so forth. I stayed there 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, you could buy for $10,000, and that money way back then, you could buy an IBM AT. It was a box, a 50-pound box, this huge thing. But it was open chassis. You could take it apart. You could soup it up. You could put in different crystals to make it run faster, and put in graphic cards. And I could duplicate at home what I had at Pratt. So there begins 15 years of me running after the train. The train is mathematics, and I'm just trying to catch up with the mathematics. As soon as I finished a work like this, there was something else to study. There are two-dimensional patterns, three-dimensional patterns, four-dimensional patterns, non-Euclidean patterns, quasi-crystal patterns. And so for 15 years, I was just chasing after this. The next step was to have the relief sculpture without the painted lines, and have the painted lines be the actual cast shadows of the metal rods. 2/3 of what you see here is just light. On the wall, it looks a lot whiter than you see in these pictures. Where red and blue shine together, you get white, because there's enough yellow in the red and enough yellow in the blue to fill out this spectrum. But where you block out the red, you see only blue. Where you block out the blue, you see red. And so you can wear anaglyphic 3D glasses, red and blue glasses, and you really do see two objects in the same place at the same time, magically passing through one another. In fact, if you're wearing the glasses and you're walking on the floor of the museum or the studio, you're making a four-dimensional rotation happen. You're actually walking in the fourth dimension. The last element in this 15-year quest was quasi-crystals, studying quasi-crystals, quasi-regular crystalline structures, a kind of mathematics that was only invented, in the early 80s. I spent a while learning to program them, and grateful for all the help that mathematicians and physicists gave me. One of the key features of this is the shadows on the floor. As the sun passes, the shadows do not slide, but they change as though they were a kaleidoscope, change from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. That's said that wrong. They change from twofold to threefold to fivefold symmetry. They're alive, and it's very exciting. You see the same thing if you're underneath it looking up. You look straight up, you see five-pointed stars. To the right, everything looks like it's made out of cubes, and to the left, everything appears to be triangles, and yet there's no moving parts. It's just quasi-crystal geometry. Now, in 1994, that piece was dedicated, and I left. I was exhausted. I was tired of public art. I was tired of committee work. I just wanted to be back in my studio. I thought I'd gone too far from being a painter, and I liked the freedom and the isolation of the studio, where I could do whatever I wanted to without calling a meeting and making an agenda and working towards a consensus. If it was blue and I wanted it red, 5 minutes later it was red. And it took a while, but through the next this is 99, so this is 5 years after I returned from Denmark. And the paintings are very much like the paintings of 20 years before, except that the patterns are lattices. They're not defined by a two-dimensional shape. They're defined by a polyhedra. And they're curved. They warp over and under each other and pass through one another. In higher dimensional space, they would slip over and under each other. But when projected into 3 dimensions and then again to 2 dimensions, you have the artifact of the projection where it looks like they're passing through one another. And you need that paradox in order to really learn to see them. This was another really great period for me, 99 to 2006. Here's a very clear example of that. This painting has been reproduced in math journals and interdisciplinary journals. I've shown it in every one of the retrospectives I have. You can really get a sense for the quality of the interweaving of the lattices. You get lost in it. You got to let go and just fly through it and let it wash over you. And that's part of it too, that you learn to tolerate, to you find the giddy joy in this complete confusion of different spaces. Now, life intercedes, and in 2006, terrible tragedies, deaths in the family. I got really nasty cancer, and I thought, well, it was Monet in the beginning, so it's going to be Monet at the end. And the work becomes much softer, much more painterly. This is my last work I did in acrylic. I wanted to move upstate, spend more time upstate in that studio and paint in oil, where there's just a greater freedom and a greater density of color. Emphasize the color, de-emphasize the geometry. And there begins a long series of work, which really is continuing today from about 2008 to the present. The work is much more painterly. You're in the thick of it, and the geometry is still there with the same intent, but it's not so absolutely dominant. These paintings are. This is one from just a couple of years ago. They're very, very hard to photograph. I feel that I can't really show them to you. With digital photography, you either get the warms or you get the colds, but the whole point of these paintings is the balance between the warm and cold colors and the transparency. This is a painting I like very, very much. I have nothing new to say about it. And here's a painting I did just last summer. I've slowed down, as I get older, and also as I feel more vulnerable. I only do 4 or 5 paintings a year. I do the underpaintings in the city in New York and in acrylic, and then I bring them up to the Gilboa where the house is and the studio is, and spend a long time working on these paintings. They look like they're slapped and dashed, but they could be worked on for years before they're finally finished. Now, the 70s. I'm a child of the 70s. I became an artist during the 70s. For those of you who are under 65, I don't know if you've ever lived in a period like the 70s. It was awful, horrible. We had the Vietnam War. We had multiple political assassinations. We had race riots in major cities, plural. It was a terrible time, but it also was a fabulous, magical time. The thought police were in abeyance. The cultural police hadn't been born yet. You could do anything. You could be anybody. You could shapeshift. You could try on different identities. You were free to try out anything. And I'm going to let Linda Ronstadt be the metonymy and to stand for the whole. Here she is on the left in a Cub Scout shirt with hot pants. Right there, that right there is gender bender. And she became very early an arena rock star, just able to fill up a sports arena. And only a couple of years later, she's singing Gilbert and Sullivan in a bonnet. And this is Patience, and there's this mock soprano trills, and she's doing that. So, And only a year or two after that, on the left, she's singing 50s torch songs. Quite a bit of raunch, quite different from that Gilbert and Sullivan. And a couple of years after that, here she is in her little Labner Daisy May outfit, singing country with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris. And next, her final iteration is as a mariachi singer, flowers piled on her head. And she's singing, she's backed up by a band with these sombreros. These guys have sombreros that are like 4 feet wide. And female mariachi parts are extremely difficult to sing. And she managed that. So think of us in the 70s becoming mature artists during that period. Now, my last point, and you'll indulge me another 5 minutes maybe. This is Vasari, who was writing in 1550 and the lives of the painters and architects. And he said, there are 2 kinds of painters. There are painters who bring their work to life with disegno, which not only means design and drawing and composition and perspective and figures in action, all of that. Or they're painters that bring their paintings to life with colore. Now, I know this is true. People come to my studio and they want to quibble with me about the drawing or the pattern or something. And then other people come in and they're just speechless because of the color. They're seeing the color, not the drawing. So compared to all that has been written, libraries of books been written about disegno, composition, and what does it mean if the eyes are below the midway on the canvas, and how do you integrate the figure with the field in a portrait, and how does perspective work, and on and on and on. There is nothing about color. Now, a few people, like Goethe, for example, has a very idiosyncratic system, but it doesn't catch on. The person who, I got to show you this painting first. This is an example of a painting that Vasari says is a painting that brings its meaning to life in color. This is The Three Philosophers by Giorgione, about 1510. Some people, Giorgione died very young, in his early 30s from the plague, and some people feel that it was finished by the Bellinis, but let's call it a Giorgione. I saw this painting 3 times. The first time, it's in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. The first time I saw it, I was young and on my first honeymoon, I could say. And I was green. I was looking out at the landscape. I thought that that person had a musical instrument in his hands. It turns out I was wrong about that. But Giorgione was a musician and a charmer, and I identified with him. Now, the man next to him in red, look at that headdress, and he's kind of conquered the sky with that headdress, and he's bold and stepping forward. I thought maybe he'd be an Arabic businessman in Venice, doing mosaics all over the Levant. And what's that in his hand? Is that money? Is that a money bag? That heavy thing. I saw it in my 40s when we went from Venice. My wife Rena and my son Max were in Venice, and we were going to Budapest for a math conference. And we got off the train, spent the day only in Vienna so that I could go and see this painting again. And then I saw it again in my 60s in Washington, D.C. I got there at the opening bell. I raced through the museum to get to this painting at the end of the show. And I had it to myself for 20 minutes. And I was a gray beard then, like this guy dressed in autumn colors, somewhat broken by life, but mathematics was my solace. And you can't see it here, but his page is geometry, drawings on geometry. I mention this because a painting which masters color can be a companion for your whole life. Now, the man who did the most to make a workable color theory was Joseph Albers. He started in the Bauhaus, brought his studies to Cranbrook, and then to Yale. And when I was a graduate student at Yale, I took the Albers color course. And then the next semester, the next year, I was the teaching assistant in that color course. And when I finally got out of that hellhole, I was a teacher in college, a teaching studio, and I taught the Albers color course, 2 or 3 sections every semester for years. Well, a few years anyway. And I tell you, it holds no more magic for me, and it's not everything. It's not really all that much, but it's all we have. So I want to tell you something now about color, which you already know, but haven't thought about for a while. When I was a boy of 7, that was 70 years ago, in my bubble gum, I got a magic dot. And the instructions were, you stare at this red dot without blinking for 2 minutes, and then look at a white wall, and by magic, you will see a green dot. Well, even at 7, I knew it wasn't magic. I knew that red was coming in, and green was going out to block it. Green was going out. So if you remove the red, you'd see the green for a little bit. But I did not understand the true meaning of after images until recently. See that guy on the right in his skin onesies? If he was a person who would get stoned out looking at the color, he would not be much help in the mastodon hunt. And so I think we are selected over hundreds of thousands of years to see shape and to see movement. But it's not really useful to dwell on or to be excited by color until you get to be a farmer about 10,000 years ago, when you need to be able to look at a green leaf and say, it'll take a whole cycle of the moon before this leaf is at the peak of its nutrition. So we're fighting a lot of selection here. we generally think of ourselves as muscle and bone taking action in the world. But you could lose an arm and a leg or all of them, and you'd still be you. What you really are is a collection of gushy things inside, squirting enzymes to one another in this crazy cybernetic comic contraption, and half the time working against each other. So when you have artists who are dedicated to showing you color, can bring it back to you, you got to honor that. And we should all get an Oscar for a lifetime of achievement in color. I'll read you these names: Cynthia Carlson, Brad Davis, Valerie Jodin, Kim McConnell, Jane Kaufman, Joyce Kozloff, Robert Kushner, Tony Robbin, Miriam Shapiro, Ned Smythe, and Robert Sakanich. And with that, I conclude my talk. Thanks for watching.